Mark Ferrier, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks. It's been a journey. You and I have known each other for a while. So it's actually fun to get to spend some time together on it.
We have, and I was trying to remember how we got connected, and for the life of me, I can't. So maybe at some point over a beer, we'll remember. But
I can give you the quick version. You want the quick version?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So at the time, you had your newsletter, which is like the B2B gospel of all gospels. And Microsoft was one of our biggest clients at the time when I was running an agency. And Microsoft's B2B team kept sending me this newsletter. And then I reached out to you because Microsoft asked me to, in sort of like this, hey, can you go see if we can do a partnership deal with them? And then you and I actually met in 𝙬𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙇 in Liberty Village. And about 15 minutes into the conversation, it totally turned to you being an entrepreneur and giving me perspective on my business and a service business and what the right time to sell and scale. And so that's how we met. And that must have been like 2007.
Oh my gosh. That was years ago. Wow. Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm glad we got a chance to connect. And as we talked about before I hit record, you're kind of a 3-for-1 deal here because we're going to talk about 3 different businesses. And 2 of which you started and exited. So we'll talk about the Built to Sell story. And then now you're in the business of buying companies. And I want to get into that and how you think about that. But first, I want to get into the story of launch. So walk me through, what was this business? How did it get started? How did you end up owning a piece of it?
Yeah, it's a great story. It's one of those where you always have a desire to be an entrepreneur, but then there's barriers to entrepreneurship, right? One is you need the right idea. One is capital. One is structure. One is resources. And so I worked for some guys in a marketing business right at a university almost. And the sort of key person was a bit of a mentor of mine. And when I worked for that business, I worked for about 5 or 6 years. And it was around 2000, probably 99. And the reason I know it was 99 was because I actually jumped to go work on the internet for Oxford Properties and John Love, who launched an internet-driven business. And I was super excited to go do it. And the reason I know is because that only lasted about a year, and then all the capital dried up in about 2000. And at that time, I was going to go launch a marketing company with this crazy idea of how do you drive offline consumers online and online consumers into the offline environment and sort of do this. I guess today you'd call it an integrated marketing company, but I thought it was this creative idea that I had both, but I had no money and I had no customers. And honestly, these guys offered me a great offer. They said, hey, come back and work with people you know, and they respect you and like you. You don't have the capital to go build your business right now. And so they had a premiums and incentives business, like literally. It was called Sunstar Marketing. And they had a guy running it. He was an amazing guy named Corey. And Corey had a vision to run it, and he was amazing at it. And they said, hey, look, we think this business can be more than just premiums incentives business. And they owned at the time a marketing company that did sampling for like the Pepsi Taste Patrol, and Microsoft was one of their clients, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, it seems kind of boring to me. And I wanted to build this integrated idea. And they said, well, how about this? You take the business. We will give you 10% of the business as sweat equity. And you have to run it for 1 year as it is. And after 1 year, when you close it off, if you make a profit, we'll let you transform the business. And, as a 25 or 26-year-old person who came from no money and suddenly got to be an entrepreneur, and I got to call myself the president, it seemed like a hell of an opportunity. And on top of that, the guys were super great to me. They said, hey, look, you need a break. So they let me go away to Australia for almost 2 months before I went back and did this. And then I came back and I did exactly what they asked me to, which was I got into the business. We ran it for a year.
Mark, just let me pause. I just want to get clarity. When you say the guys, these are the founders and managers of the business? Like who are letting you in?
It's a great clarification and super imperative to how the narrative goes. So they were 3 co-partners in, for lack of a better term, a sister company that had started this company. And it was more of an offshoot of their core business. To put in perspective, and these are round numbers, but at the time, the business that I took over was probably like $1 million in revenue, just under, I think, not making any money. And their sort of mothership business, which was more of an integrated marketing business, was probably $30 or $40 million in revenue. So this was a business that they started to add additional services to their current clients and hadn't really got to scale. I used to work in the integrated business, running an experiential division with them. And then left, obviously came back when they convinced me to sort of join them as a partner. Okay.
And just for clarity, the business unit that was around $1 million was in the business of premiums and incentives.
Yeah.
That kind of, so things like the Pepsi challenge and giving away, juice things at supermarkets and that kind of stuff?
Hat, t-shirts, golf balls. That's the way I describe it. Hats, t-shirts, golf balls.
Got it. Okay.
That was that business when I originally became a partner in it.
Okay. And when you say they gave you 10% of the business in sweat equity, did they give 10% of the entire business or just the $1 million company?
That's a small business. This is a small business.
Got it. Okay.
Very important part to the longer part of the theory, which was I owned a small piece of the smallest entity that was treated as an independent organization attached to, for lack of a better term, the mothership.
Was it legally an independent part? Like, was it incorporated separately?
It totally was. It was because they had different shareholders. In other words, they had 2 additional shareholders in the smaller company, which was at the time was called Sunstar Marketing. We evolved that name to launch over time, which is part of the story. But yeah, so the 3 core owners of the master company owned it, and 2 people that had actually 3 people. This is where it gets interesting. Had a sweat equity deal. Their CFO of the mother company did, and then the current founder or person running it, and then they brought me in as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Where does it go from there?
Yeah, so it was interesting, right? So frame the context up. 1, I was 26 years old. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was full of piss and vinegar, but didn't really have the other toolboxes, and they provided them in a platform. And so we built that business, and it was a really good business that we figured out how to way to be distinct and unique and all the things that we'd say to, when you're trying to figure out your product. And the business was growing. I think we took it from probably like $1 million in revenue to probably $2 million in revenue, fully integrating with some of their bigger clients, and the business was great. And then, problem number 1, and I would say the minority partner dilemma. And when I say that, I say it with a totally lateral view of I had the dilemma and my partners had a dilemma, right? So, and this is sort of the interesting part about how I would view it. And so the first part about it is I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm doing all the hard work. I'm growing this business and I own 10% of it. And then the other partners, I, got into this. Well, what's their value? What's my value? How does it work? I'm managing the employees. And so that was sort of part 1 of, I think, the gap, right? Let's call it the minor equity gap. And I don't think the communications were strong, and I don't think expectations were good. I don't think there was a lot of alignment around how this ended up in 3 to 5 years. And that would be one of my probably biggest failures, that I don't think I did a good enough job of getting alignment of what success looks like. And then when it is successful, how does that work out for both parties on the minority and majority partner? So, call this crack number 1. And then, so I went and did what most people would do. I went and vented and probably got some advice from people, and their answers always came back the same, which is just go get more equity. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't know how to do that at the time. But they said, if that's really what you think the end goal is to get more value, and you think the value is through equity, you got to go get equity. And so, this is probably my first error in a bunch of errors, which is I looked at the cap table and I said, okay, well, I can't really go and try and get equity from the majority founders. And there were 2 minor partners. One was in the trenches with me day to day, and the other one was, for lack of a better term, a fractional CFO. And so he owned 10%, I owned 10%. I went to him and said, hey, I want to buy you out. And it seemed very reasonable as an ambitious 26-year-old of, hey, you want to acquire more? This is the way to do it. And honestly, I went to go treat him fairly. And it wasn't that we had a way to undervalue him or undercut him. I just said, hey, I want to own more. Here are the reasons why. Unfortunately, you're the person that I think is the least amount of disruption in the model to go to. Him and I were friends, had a big falling out. Probably 5 years later, we're friends again, is a good example, but in the story. But, and I think there's 2 things that I realized in it at this point. One, I underestimated the balance of active involvement and intellectual involvement in a business at this point with minor partners, right? People put minor partners in place for reasons, for the most part, I would say, right? And he provided a good one, which he was the financial controls. He was the financial mechanisms. He kept a young, highly ambitious person on the rails, right? He kept everything in place. And so the other partners were not happy about it because they had 2 problems. One, they suddenly had the person not wanting to work with that person, him and I. And they had a problem in their core business, which this person was the CFO of their bigger business. And so interestingly, I was very naive in the sense of not understanding the ripple effect of all of those. But I was hell-bent on I was being treated unfairly and I should get more equity. And so this was the way to do it in what I thought was an equitable way, in the sense of I would purchase it. Like I would go buy it and I would go own more. I'm not begging for more equity. And
what
so that was
his
sort
reaction?
of the start of it. Well, his reaction was super emotional because, from his standpoint, they didn't have ownership for him in the big business. And he was an entrepreneur like me in this smaller entity. And so I didn't factor any of that in. Like it was super naive of me, right? The reason that I wanted more equity was because I was fueled and it was emotional and I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I didn't factor any of that into the conversation on the other side of the table. And so it got fractured fast. It got awkward fast. It stalled the business for a little bit, which was, as you can imagine, hyper distracted to focus on these minor equity partners and the relationships affecting the mothership. I call it the mothership all the time. And so, we stalled for a long period of time. And then, I think the second big learning came in, which is in most of these relationships, there becomes a divide, right? People sort of, which team are they on at a certain point, right? And so the team positioning sort of started. And, two of the partners sort of sided with me and said, well, we don't like it, but he did it in a way that was respectful. And yes, there's a mechanism in the shareholders agreement to do that.
What was the mechanism in the shareholders agreement?
There was an EV, like there was a purchasability, that there was an enterprise value that was pegged on the business. I think it was like a 3 times multiple last 2 years EBIT. It may have been 4, but it was a super reasonable fair market value that you didn't have to go to a third party to get it valued. And so that was good. So we knew the value of it. It was pretty black and white. But then what happened was, and this is where I wasn't I could have handled it differently in learnings, being a bit more mature, was they wanted to overpay him on the enterprise value. Because they said, hey, look, this was unexpected. Yes, there's a mechanism for that. But like in all pieces, there's the black and white piece, and then there's the community and relationship piece to every agreement. And they wanted to overvalue sort of the community relationship part of the agreement. And I was really pissed off with it. To be honest, I was like, hold on a minute, then increase the value of all of our shares. Like if you want to change the deal, once again, naively so. I was wrong. They did a super good job of treating the person fairly in a really uncomfortable situation. And then what happened was he honestly was probably the most courteous person once the deal was done, still was the CFO. Still was a big champion for the company, and the business grew. So I think in some ways the business itself needed to be either decoupled from that situation, or I, as sort of the driver of the business, had to get to the motivational or equivalent to, I thought this was the value creation model for me to push forward. And the business turned out, I think we grew the business to it was probably around $5 million. That premium incentives piece of the business was a still smaller part of the business. We built it to a bit of a environmental design business. So we design environments for like Pepsi and Xbox, doing big music festivals. And it was a super cool, awesome business. It really, really was. But the learning was the fracturing that I did in the partnership never went away. It actually never went away. And so that was the beginning of the end of that relationship and that deal, and sort of probably one of my biggest learnings in business to date, which has set my trajectory.
So the part-time CFO, what if he had just said, no, Mark, I don't want to sell you my shares?
Yeah, at that point, I'd said that I was willing to walk away and go do it on my own. But that was more arrogance than reality. I don't think I would have. I think I probably would have found a way to either try and renegotiate the deal. Because for me, it was super exciting to be an entrepreneur. And I didn't really have the means to do it any other way. And so I think ultimately he was a bigger man. I don't think my process was a great way. And I think that he had a bigger view that, hey, look, okay, this isn't ideal, but the business should succeed because there's other people involved. And so he made that choice, somewhat coerced by other partners. I think for me, it was more, I let pride get in the way of logical thinking at that moment in the part of my career as an entrepreneur. And I don't think that I fully appreciated all the aspects of being an entrepreneur with humble leadership and all those types of things. At that point, I thought for me, it was, the way to really drive a business was to be the founder and say that you were sort of the person in charge, and didn't realize all the other stuff that is super important to make real businesses work.
So the original deal on paper was the value was going to be 3 to 4 times EBIT, like the average of the last 2 years.
Yeah.
The mothership wanted to pay a premium because there was this relationship. What was the mothership wanting to pay in terms of multiple of EBITDA?
Yeah, it's a good point. And in hindsight, I don't really know, but it would for sure have been 1 or 2 times higher than that. And to be fair, if you think about the value, the business was probably doing $1.5 million. At that point, we were maybe doing, a couple $100,000 to the bottom line. So, as a multiple, it probably would end up a couple terms, but, it was demonstrative, probably a few extra $100,000 on a business that wasn't doing a lot. So it seemed like a greater amount than probably the multiple term.
How'd you come up with the money?
This is where it gets interesting, right? Because they actually had to go lend the money back to the company to actually go do the buyout, right?
The
other
had
founders.
to lend the
company
company money to buy.
Yeah, so I had a little bit of it that I would say was built through the sweat equity through my part of the earnings, and that had to go back into it. And the deal was that part of the earnings would have to go back against the payment, and then they basically fronted the other amount until either I came up with it or lent it back or the company paid it back. And so in essence, what happened was the company ended up buying the shares back, and then the company then prorated the shares back into directly at me.
So you ended up owning 20% of this business?
About 20% of the company, yeah.
Okay.
Because of that last little transaction that I said where the company actually acquired them and then had to send them back, I think in, call it full trajectory, I was about 18% of the business, yeah.
Okay. And then where does it go from there? So you've got this sort of fractured tension with the founders. You've kind of shown your cards. You've revealed yourself as this like ambitious, hard to corral guy. What happens next?
Yeah, I think 2 big things happened. One, the employees felt it. And so interestingly, that was probably bad scenario number 1, is that the employees felt the fractured and the tension, because it wasn't like we were totally separate families, as they call it, family running this business, right? And it was obvious that I had driven one direction and other people had driven other directions. And so, first of all, there's a bit of fracturing inside the employee base, which I would say, once again, great shared learning. Man, I was naive to not think that would start to happen. And so that was part A. And then the part B was the partners had sort of picked 2 sides of the fence, right? And there was a divide. And I guess the last piece in that was what happened then was every time there was a challenge in the business, it just was put on steroids. Right? Because we'd already gone through this fracturing inside the business. And so sooner or later, what ended up happening was 2 of us wanted to go one direction in the company and the other 2 wanted to go another direction in the company. And 2 of us then approached them to try and purchase the whole company because we thought that would be an easier model. And it wasn't, because if you think about the complication of how it was funded, there was a whole other company that was funded. That company was more demonstrative to their net worth than this company. And so then what ended up happening was we sort of got into this standoff of everybody disagreed, but nobody could agree on a path forward. And then you, like probably most businesses that you've talked to, sooner or later, you end up going to the agreement, right? And because the agreement will drive mechanisms to try and resolve roadblocks.
This is the shareholders agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. The shareholders agreement. And it was interesting because the coaching I was given on the shareholders agreement from both them and my lawyer, honestly, was, look, you negotiate this stuff hard, and then hopefully it only goes in the left drawer of your desk and you never have to look at it again. You go build a great business. And so naively, I probably didn't fully understand that agreement or how the terms of that agreement worked. And in that was a pretty standard clause, a shotgun clause. And the shotgun clause honestly seemed really, really big and scary at the time. Right. And I can describe it. If
Please do.
Like. Yeah. So ultimately, in most agreements, I think, or in a large part, there's a shotgun agreement, which sounds really scary. It basically says, if we disagree, I can offer to buy you out at a said price. And interestingly, the price doesn't even have to be driven by the mechanism that is in other parts of the clause of the agreement. It's just a price. But the way that most work is that there's a time frame against that offer, and there's a reciprocality against that offer. So I could offer my partners $1 million for their shares, and then I would have to wait, and they would have totally their choice. They could either decide to sell me at $1 million, or they have to buy me at $1 million. And so at the time, it seemed like a crazy, scary thing, right? Where you're going to put an offer out and try and figure out what price to go in at, because you can't lowball the price. If you lowball the price, then you're going to end up selling at a lower price. And so, as we were going through all this conflict, it really forced me at that time, I called myself a bit of a wannabe entrepreneur, right? Because I hadn't put my own cash up. I was running the businesses, but it really forced me to understand what my priorities were, which was, okay, was I willing to now come up with this money? And was I passionate enough that I believed that with that and the new face forward of the business, that we could actually go drive the business forward? And at the same time, probably like most founders in a certain piece of their business, I believe that the business defined me at the time, right? I wanted to be a founder. I didn't want to be an entrepreneur. Sorry, I didn't want to be an employee. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. This was my shot. And so this one clause actually drives a lot of clarity in what you want in these really tensive situations, I would say. And so I went back and forth a bunch of times. My intention was actually to try and buy the business. And so I was working on an offer to go try and buy the business.
You and this partner of yours.
Yep. So and then right in the middle of it, I ended up getting a shotgun from one of the partners where they set the price. And then I had 10 days. And so this is where the naivety of everything that I've explained to you leading up to this point really comes to a crescendo, because I was like, well, this is like, whoa, what do you mean you're shotgunning me? Because I'm the guy driving the business. And they basically said, hey, look, we don't want to deal with it anymore. And so the business needs resolution, and we're prepared to have you walk in order to get resolution. And we'd rather be the drivers of it than the acceptors of it. And as irrational as that sounded at the time, it makes total logical sense now in hindsight. I've been through cycles in businesses where as the majority partner, you kind of have to take control of that situation. And as the minority partner, you've kind of got to realize that if you want control of it, you really have to be proactive on it. And I would say proactive on all fronts of it: the pricing, the terms, the relationships, the communication. Because interestingly, and I don't know unilaterally, but I would say for the most part, I believe this is true based on most of the understandings I've had around them, is that shotgun agreements are one-to-one, not one-to-many or company-to-one. And so this is where the nuance of it got really interesting for us, which is even if I'd said yes to buying the first partner, the second partner could have just increased the price on me. And then I would have had to go say yes to that piece, or I would have been stuck in this situation where I'd owned part of it, but couldn't get all of it.
I see. So one partner said, look, I'm going to buy your shares. And you had to decide that one partner. And then once you consummated that deal, you could have been shotgunned again by the second partner.
Or I would have had to shotgun.
Okay.
Because, at that point, let's assume I could have acquired 35% of the company, but I still had 65% out there in individuals. And so once again, entrepreneurial naivety around these agreements and shotguns and minority partners versus majority partners. I hadn't really understood that part of the equation, which was not only did I have to go negotiate those in pieces, the price could have changed every single time just based on that clause. And so I ended up declining it. And
declining it, meaning they offered to buy you out.
And I said, okay, I would sell, but I wouldn't buy back. And so when I mean decline, and the reason I use decline, and maybe not the right term, but I ended up leaving the company.
Okay.
I ended up going to them and saying, you know what, I didn't want to get into this multiple situation. I actually at one point tried to find if there was a way to navigate around the shotgun, but once it was in process, it was in process. And so I ended up selling the business and
selling your shares in it to them.
Yeah. And it was for around like $216,000. Call it. It was about that.
That represented what multiple of EBITDA? I'm trying to think were they fair to you in the 3 to 4 times EBITDA?
Yeah, they were pretty fair to me. Yeah. If you would assume the business did maybe 200,000, then I own 20%. So the math is pretty fair from that standpoint, right? The math was pretty fair. And the reason being is that they had to be prepared on the other side that I would buy them at that, and they didn't want to undervalue their shares. Mm-hmm. And so as a mechanism, it seems like a really brutal mechanism, in a shareholders agreement. But when you get to the part where you've sort of either blown past or haven't respected enough other ways to manage dispute, I actually thought it was, in hindsight, probably the most rational way to not tank a whole company based on a dispute or irreconcilable differences from that standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that happens. And, that part of the story is complicated, and I can answer a bunch more questions. But it all leads to even greater people suing each other and
go further. What happens next? I'm done. What happens next?
So I end up leaving the business and still probably have a little bit of that chip on my shoulder and a high amount of naivety, as you think. But at that point, I'm, probably closer to 29 or 30. I've got some great relationships.
What's going on for you in your personal life? Are you married? You kids? Like, you have dependents? The reason I'm trying to get a sense of, like, do you need the money? Or are you still just like,
no. That's more money than I ever had, especially growing up how I did with some of my parents and some of the, the speed wobbles that they had. Having $200,000 in my bank account was like I was a millionaire. Like I literally thought it was the greatest thing ever. But I didn't have a job and I didn't have my passion to doing the things that I was doing. And so fortunate enough, I'd built enough good relationships and I think I delivered a good enough experience for most of our partners that people started calling me. Clients started calling me. And once again, a really interesting learning through this whole process was I had to then navigate what the difference between non-competition and non-solicitation was. And once again, John, I had no thought process of this when I was in the middle of a shotgun agreement, understanding what those other clauses mean. But suddenly I had to get a really good education in understanding the difference between a non-compete. And non-competes are a little bit different today than they would have been in 2004 or 5, right? Enforceability in Ontario. But the non-solicitation is pretty black and white how that works. And so I do.
Folks who don't know the difference, just describe the difference between the two.
Yeah. So non-compete basically tries to say you can't do anything that competes against us as a company in any entity. And where that used to be enforceable was very favorable to the employer. Because if I'd only done marketing, or if I was only a lawyer, or I was only one thing in my career and then I left and I'd done that for 20 years, how can I not compete in the one thing I'm good at over time? And so the good news is the legal system is pared back on that a bit in Ontario from a non-compete standpoint. But at the time, it wasn't as black and white, but they basically said, hey, look, you've got to earn a living. Mark, we believe you can be in marketing. You shouldn't directly compete against a project or anything that you'd understood in the last 12 months. So can't do that. No problem.
That was part of your shareholders agreement.
Yeah. In other words, if I had knowledge about something that would have had intellectual property from my past, I couldn't have forced that forward and go try and use that to my advantage. Totally understood that made sense from a non-compete standpoint to me. And then the non-solicitation, I really had to understand. And in the essence of it, the basics of it were basically, I couldn't go to our clients and say, I have a new shingle, come work for me. And that seems pretty simple. But there's a big nuance in that of how black and white you need to be to respect it, to really not put anything in the ethos that could say, well, I sneakily told my friend or ex-employee that I'm doing this and they should tell you to call me. And so I literally at the time had to have clients fax non-solicitation waivers to my legal firm for me to even return a phone call of theirs. And if you think about that at the time, like that and our clients were like, well, Sleeman's was a client and Microsoft was a client and they were big clients. So to get them to do this, I thought was impossible and insanity. And I'm sure my ex-partners did at the time, but crazier things happen. I suddenly getting these faxes.
So these faxes, to be clear, are saying from Microsoft, we would like to work with Mark's new company. He did not solicit us. This is us doing this on our own.
Yeah. Microsoft's probably a bad example. So let's take Microsoft out as an example. And the reason was they sort of, in a very good way, Microsoft was like, look, anyone's business is not my problem. I run my business. I pick our partners.
Yeah.
Right. But some of our other partners, that's exactly what they did. They said, hey, look, we really like Mark's service. We really thought that he did a good job. I hear he's starting a new company. We want to do some consulting or we want to do some projects for us. And I would have to say to them, well, I can't return your phone call. Please call our lawyer. And basically the piece of paper would say, Mark didn't reach out to us. We're legally binding that we didn't do that. And that we approached him to do services for us, black and white. And then once that would get approved, I could actually follow up with people and start to go do work.
I love this.
I know. Well, I wish I could tell you it ends there. And so, you kind of got to put it into those two buckets, right? Of partners that were sort of said, hey, that was a good idea. And then bigger corporations who said, look, none of this is my problem. Go from there, right? And so I was very fortunate that I had enough of both of those buckets of partners say, hey, look, we will work with you. Some were all in and said, we really want to work with you. We believe in what you said. Whether they did that because they disagreed on how the past company went, or they were super passionate about our services, or we just had a better idea. They were really passionate. And some individuals at those companies were super supportive of us. And so we started to build our business. And then at the same time, some of the other corporations said, well, look, this is not our fight to get into, but if you're willing to take the risk in working with us, in other words, we're not going to pay you for 90 days until projects are done and you have to prove that you can do this work, then we'll work with you. And so I was fortunate enough to get a bit of both of those businesses and clients. And, we were building a good business. We were pretty small at the time. I think at the time I maybe had 4 or 5 employees. So, on aggregate, we were probably doing a few $100,000 in sales, maybe $500,000 or $600,000 in
Mark,
sales.
Is this the early iteration of Traffic? What became Traffic?
This is Traffic. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I originally set it up as a consultancy. And then that actually, by the time I'd hired 4 or 5 employees, we actually changed the name to Traffic. And so Traffic at the time was running, and we started to sort of build a small agency, for lack of a better term, at the time. So yes, it's a great point. So this was around 2004, 2005. And so we started to build the business, and the business, we were probably about 6 months into the business. And then I started to get rumblings that my ex-world was not very happy about it, and that they believed that the non-solicit, non-compete, there was some gray area. And then honestly, I think that there was a second piece to it that I was unable to see at the time, which was they built a great business and they had a bunch of employees and they had a bunch of customers. And suddenly they got into this dispute, and I leave and go try and start a new business that, even though I would say was not competing, was close enough that they kind of had to make a stand, right? And at the time, you can imagine what I'm about to say next, I was really not happy of. But in hindsight, as an entrepreneur, I'm like, you've kind of got to protect the pieces of your business that are core. And in those service businesses, typically they're your people on both sides of the fence, the clients that adore you and love you and support you all the time, and the employees that come to work every day and love you and support you. And when you have somebody leave and be as disruptive to that, as I didn't think I was, but in hindsight, I must have been, you kind of got to draw a line in the sand. And so, to answer your earlier question, I just started dating Beth, who I'm married to now. And we were sort of cohabitating. She was at my house a lot. And by that point, I remembered, I'd found out that they were going to sue me. And I'd found out about it because they were obviously had to go to some other partners and clients and sort of try and build the position. And so as I found that out, I was like, oh, that's going to be really bad. Like, I didn't understand that. That was terrifying to me. You get angry. You're like, I did nothing wrong. I followed all these agreements. And so, at the time, our lawyer said, well, look, there's evidence that they'd obviously gone to the marketplace and said some things. And so, unfortunately, you're going to have to sue them back. And so
wait, you're going to sue them back for what?
Defamation and a bunch of, basically messaging in the marketplace that was preventing me from being able to be successful or even run my business.
So you get wind that they're going to sue you because
Correct.
You haven't honored the spirit of the non-solicitation, non-compete.
Correct.
You get wind of that, and the lawyer's like, well, you better, they've been bad-mouthing you in the marketplace, so you better reciprocate and sue them for defamation.
Yeah. And at the time, I get it. And I get it even now as hey, this is not going to go well. There's got to be a strategy that at least we understand that there's some balance in this. And honestly, I hated every minute of it. I hated every minute of all pieces of it, right? I didn't
100%.
want to sue. for me, it seemed like the wrong way to solve a problem.
Sure.
And on the flip side, I was terrified to be sued. Right.
What a bet.
And then once I realized I got sued, and here's the personal relationship part. I remember this vividly. We lived at College in Clinton at the time. There was a men's clothing store called Pasqualino. And I lived right above it. There was this bay window, and Beth was in the bay window. And I remember she came home and I said to her, hey, so I'm going to get sued. And she's like, what? How can you get sued? And I'm like, I'm going to get sued. And I don't think it's going to be like for $10 because there's businesses and clients involved. At the time, I had no idea what was going to happen. And I remember she looking at me like, well, do you have money to be sued? And I'm like, well, no, all I have is the money they gave me. And I've spent most of it trying to hire some employees and build a business. So I don't really know how this is all going to go down. But, the narrative in a funny story was now it was a bit of a game of who was going to get served papers first. And so you start suing everyone. And so what ended up happening was I literally had a hideout in my house for about 3 days. And Beth at the time would leave to go to work and there'd be someone running her down the street saying, hey, do you know Mark Ferrier? And she'd say, I have no idea who this person was. And
she must have really loved you, Mark. Just to be clear, she must have really, really liked you.
I think she has a lot of tolerance for me now. But yes, I think in those days, we really built some loving, interesting relationships. And to the point where at the time, there was a restaurant on Queen Street in Toronto called 𝙎𝙐𝙇𝙇 that a really good friend of mine was opening. And it was the grand opening night. And I had a little bit of investment in that. And so I had to leave the house. And so I literally remember crawling over the back fence of our house at the time, going down the back alley and knocking on a restaurant door on College Street and having to walk through the restaurant while Beth picked me up on the street so I could avoid getting served by papers.
Why? Sorry, this is a hilarious story, but why did you not want to get served? What was
apparently at the time, and I'm not a legal expert, I'm sure you have a lawyer on the phone, but it was an order of the cases being registered in the Ontario legal system.
Okay.
And so our lawyer basically said, we think the strategy should be to try and get ours registered before theirs gets registered. And I guess it can't be registered until you're physically served with paper.
Got it. Okay.
Once again, I feel like I'm in a movie right now. Like I don't know any of this and I'm trying to figure it out. And once again, I was super angry and frustrated and hurt. And looking back on it, I totally understand rationally why these guys did what they needed to do. Right? And so I finally got served the papers and it was for $2 million. Wow. So I got sued for $2 million.
Wait, you got 200 grand when you left. How did they come up with $2 million as the,
well, it was $2 million. And scarier part of it was like, there were client names in the lawsuit around, hey, you did this for this client. You did this for that client. And, probably of 5 or 6 entrepreneurial lessons that I'm sure all the successful entrepreneurs on your podcast and in your book would tell you, right? There's these moments when in hindsight or in the moment you realize, oh shit, this is one of those moments they talk about being an entrepreneur, right? I suddenly realized, forget the money thing, because to your point, I couldn't make the math work anyway. Like you couldn't sue me for that, but because I could have never paid it. But what I realized was my whole reputation in this marketplace was in these documents, right? Like I had to go to my clients and say, I didn't do it. Your name's in it. I'm sorry. I got to get your name out of a lawsuit. The people at those businesses that stood up for me, now their boss and legal team and CFO are coming to them saying, well, whoa. I know you like these people, but now we're in the middle of all this mess. And, probably one of the lowest amounts of my entire career was realizing that part of the equation. Not even the money, realizing my entire reputation is built in this document. And if I don't figure out a way to solve that problem, the money is going to be totally irrelevant. I got to find a new career and build a new brand. And, so the lawsuit starts and, clients are involved. And then obviously clients do what all clients should do. They're like, well, I don't care what your guys' dispute is, get my name out of it. So some of them I was able to negotiate to get their name out of, and some forced themselves out of.
Mark, before you go further though, I want to know who ended up serving who. Did you finally get caught in the back alley of the restaurant? Or what
I think what ended up happening was it almost got to the same day everyone got the papers. At a certain point, we were like, we got to get on with this. I can't be crawling around my floor anymore. and the sequencing was super tight. Like I can't remember the exact sequencing, but it was finally like I got a phone call that said, look, let's just move on.
Yeah.
And so we get sued. I start to understand the papers. It's for $2 million. Clients' names are involved. I suddenly realize this is bigger than the money. And, we start to go down this process. And a few things happen in the process. One is we're still running our business. I now got to go talk to employees and say, hey, this thing from the past is now here. I had a partner at the time who wanted to be a partner and said, hey, whoa. We need to find a different deal. I don't want my name to be tied up in this. So my new future companies, partnership and shareholders agreements all got blown up. Employees were coming to me basically saying, are you really a good person, bad person? Like you can imagine, right?
Oh, man.
And part of that is because I made the choice that said I wasn't going to hide from it. I wasn't going to publicize it, but I wasn't going to hide from it because I just thought hiding from it, if you go back to like the reputation and my brand and all of that, if I hid from it, I just thought it would be the exact opposite thing to do in life. And so I didn't. And so it dragged, right? And it went back and forth and there were multiple pieces. And then, at one point there was an offer to settle, and the offer to settle was for something way more reasonable, maybe $100,000. And in the settlement, though, it was basically an acknowledgement that I'd done all the things that I shouldn't have done. I went to clients, that I premeditated this, that I put reputational things in the marketplace in order to get ahead faster. And, none of those things were true. And at the time, and it's perspective in history, right? At the time, I couldn't understand why they did all of those things. But at the end of the day, what they were trying to do was protect the people, right? Their people on their internal base and their client side. And whether I agree with how they did it, I fundamentally now can understand the rationality of being in a service business and really understanding what the ethos of your business is, which is your people, right? And your people down to trust and belief in the leadership and believing in the people. And so I understand in hindsight why they did it, but there was no way I was signing that, right? Because exactly what I just said to you is all I had going forward in the marketplace in a service business. I didn't have a product. I had a reputation, which really at the end of the day comes down to your integrity and your word. And so this lawsuit carried on and carried on and carried on and carried on. And at a certain point, they were trying to grow their business. This is probably an inconvenience and a pain in the ass to them. Somehow, some rational lawyer at a certain point got us down to, we were talking like $50,000, right? $50,000 in a minor acknowledgement around, how the business was built. And at that point, I remember sitting down with Beth and she's like, this is great. This is like $50,000 or $25,000. The company's doing well. We are done. Like, let's plan a celebratory dinner on Friday and let's just move on. And I remember saying no. And it was one of those moments in the relationship where you're like, this could be a double no. Like she could just keep walking out the door. And she sort of looked at me and she was like, pardon? Like, we're good. Like, this is going to go away. And I said, yeah, but it's not, because I'm going to know that, in a business that's all people, I didn't do this. And, I've got to stand behind it. And so through a crazy turn of events, what ended up actually happening was they were trying to do some other stuff on their business and transacted. And I guess their lawyers and whatever said, look, let's just get to a rational place. And then there was this one day, I'll never forget it. I got a call, I'll call it like 10 a.m. And the offer was, we're going to make up numbers, right? It was $25,000 and, basically no acknowledgement, but we've got to sign confidentiality agreements that we never talk about it. And so I said, no problem with the confidentiality agreements, but I can't sign $25,000. And then literally through the day, the price came down to like $5,000 at 4:00. And you can imagine my wife at this standpoint, right? Like I thought she would be like, please move on, please be crazy. And then the coolest thing happened. My wife said, no, I'm fully behind you. I totally understand. Like you 100%. And so at the end of the day, like 5 minutes before 5:00, it came across saying, okay, we'll mutually walk away. People will pay their own legal fees and we'll just sign a confidentiality agreement to the details around it. right? And so obviously I'm not giving you all the details around it right now. But, it was a great learning is that I learned that you got to stand behind what you believe in. And on the same side, I believe that I probably was very immature and irrational in understanding how my actions impacted another service organization that I told everyone I believed in and my heart was behind it. And instead of understanding a better situation to make it work for all people, and I use people, right? Because it's the client people that invest and believe in you and your people that invest and believe in you. And so I think in hindsight, that process really taught me the balance of those two things. And at the time it didn't, obviously. But I can have that conversation now and realize that I don't think I would have necessarily done anything functionally different than my ex-partners did. I probably would have handled some of the minor behaviors differently. But functionally, I think you got to stand for what you believe in, which is your people and your service. And so through a crazy string of events, from a sweat equity to a shotgun agreement to a lawsuit, it was really my first lesson in entrepreneurship.
I love that story. What an incredible turn of events, and the fact that you stuck to your guns, and I think we all kind of look back on stuff what we were like when we were 20s and think, oh, geez, sometimes it's a bit cringeworthy. At least for me, I think about some of the things I did, with all the ambition, and then you realize with a little bit of time that maybe. Well, I won't put words in your mouth, but I know. I'm grateful for you sharing the story for sure.
Yeah, I think, especially in the service-driven businesses, I think that's the thing that I learned the most is the ethos of these service businesses are super connected to the founder, the people, the clients, the passion, and I think my learnings in all of these are the structure of that agreement that you put together for partnerships. And whether they're 50-50 partnerships, which sometimes are even more challenging, as you know, and have probably experienced on the podcast, to minor partnerships. I think if you go into it with the understanding and learnings that I didn't have at the time, which was the service businesses are really about the people on both sides of the fence. And in order to keep that business existing, I think my learning is if you write share purchase agreements or shareholders agreements with that intent, I actually think you'll be in a better place for the most part and have mechanisms to protect the people on both sides of the fence, which is really the business and the brand you're in the service side, because you just don't have the assets to start dividing up.
Yeah.
And you're not, in service businesses, it's almost like a divorce more than it is a business sale at times. And I think that is where this whole experience has taught me a little bit better. And so that would be the thing that I probably naively so didn't understand till way later in life, was how to make sure that when you build those agreements, whether it's minor partnerships or whatever, that you really understand how in a service business, coming out the other end with a service business, whoever owns that service business, is really the most important part.